For years, the small lakeside community had been quiet. Not the kind of quiet that felt empty or lonely, but the kind people moved there hoping to find. The road curved gently around the lake, lined with modest cabins, wooden docks, and trees that swayed slowly whenever the wind rolled across the water. People waved to each other when they passed. Neighbors borrowed tools, watched each other's houses during vacations, and occasionally gathered on porches to watch the sunset reflect across the lake. And for the most part, the Homeowners Association existed quietly in the background. Like most HOAs, it had rules, parking guidelines, noise policies, restrictions on how properties could be used. But for years, those rules had mostly stayed on paper. Until suddenly, they didn't. It started small. A notice appeared in the mailbox one afternoon. Nothing aggressive at first. Just a reminder about the number of vehicles allowed to park near the cabin during gatherings. Technically, the rule had always existed somewhere in the HOA handbook, buried among dozens of other guidelines most residents barely remembered. At first, the notice felt harmless. The cabin's driveway comfortably held 3 cars, and friends occasionally visited on weekends. Nothing loud, no parties, just people enjoying the lake and good conversation. But only a few days later, another letter arrived. This one was different. The wording sounded more formal, almost official. It warned about unauthorized gatherings and referenced multiple HOA clauses related to parking limits, community tranquility, and residential usage restrictions. Reading it twice didn't make it clearer. Nothing happening at the cabin seemed remotely close to violating those rules. Yet the warnings continued. Soon the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time a couple of cars appeared in the driveway, another notice followed. Every time friends stopped by for coffee or conversation, the HOA seemed to know almost immediately. Someone was watching. Around the neighborhood, it wasn't difficult to guess who. One HOA board member had developed a reputation for taking rules far more seriously than anyone else. Residents often saw her slowly driving through the neighborhood roads, eyes scanning driveways and docks like she was conducting inspections. At first, people joked about it, but when the letters began arriving at the cabin regularly, the situation stopped being funny. Another notice appeared warning that repeated violations could lead to fines. The amount listed underneath the warning was surprisingly high, and suddenly the situation felt deliberate. Neighbors started quietly sharing similar experiences. Small fines issued over minor things. Warnings about parking, porch furniture placement, even decorative lights. Most people simply paid the fines and moved on, because challenging the HOA usually meant headaches no one wanted. But the pressure around the cabin kept building. Then the fine arrived. It came early one morning, printed in bold lettering across the top of the notice. According to the HOA, the property had hosted an unauthorized gathering exceeding neighborhood regulations. The fine listed beneath the accusation was large enough to get anyone's attention. The problem was, the gathering they were referencing had barely been a gathering at all, just a quiet meeting inside the cabin. A few people around a table discussing lake regulations and environmental policies affecting shoreline communities. Nothing loud, nothing disruptive. Yet somehow it had already been reported. Emails were sent to the HOA asking for clarification. Responses came slowly, and when they did, they repeated the same explanation. The violation had been documented. The fine would stand. It felt less like a conversation and more like arguing with a wall. Meanwhile, the watchful attention around the cabin only increased. Neighbors noticed the same car passing more frequently, sometimes slowing near the driveway, sometimes stopping briefly down the road. It was clear the situation had become personal. But the moment that would change everything arrived the week another meeting was scheduled at the cabin. This one had nothing to do with the HOA. Several people planned to gather privately to discuss regional environmental regulations that were beginning to affect lakeside communities across the state. Important discussions about shoreline management and policy changes that could impact hundreds of homeowners. That afternoon, several vehicles parked in the driveway. Inside the cabin, the meeting began quietly. Documents spread across the table. Coffee cups rested beside stacks of paperwork. The lake shimmered outside the windows as the group discussed complicated legal policies affecting shoreline development. From the outside, the house looked completely ordinary. But somewhere down the road, someone had already noticed the parked cars. And within the hour, a report had been made. A car pulled up near the driveway. The familiar HOA board member stepped out, holding a thick folder filled with HOA documents, violation notices, and printed regulations. From her perspective, the situation looked obvious. Multiple cars, a gathering, another violation. She walked toward the cabin with the confidence of someone who believed she had the authority to stop what was happening. Inside, no one noticed her approaching. The conversation continued around the table. Discussions about regulations, legal authority, and how certain policies might affect private homeowners across the region. Outside, the tension was building. Neighbors watching quietly from porches noticed the board member climbing the cabin steps with determined purpose. Everyone in the community knew what usually happened when she decided to enforce something personally. She reached the door. Without knocking, she pushed it open. The door slammed against the wall with a loud crack. Inside, the room went silent. The conversation stopped instantly as everyone turned toward the doorway. Standing there was the HOA board member, clutching her folder of documents. Her expression carried absolute certainty. She began stepping forward, clearly ready to deliver the speech she had prepared about unauthorized gatherings, HOA rules, and violations. But something about the room felt different. No one looked guilty. No one looked nervous. The people sitting around the table simply watched her. Then her eyes moved across the room and stopped. The man sitting across from the homeowner looked calm, professional, composed. For a moment, recognition didn't register. But as she looked closer, her confidence disappeared. Because the man she had just interrupted wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't a guest. And he definitely wasn't someone concerned about HOA parking rules. He was the state attorney general. The silence inside the cabin became almost unbearable. Only seconds earlier she had walked in believing she was the authority in the room. Now she stood in the middle of a legal meeting involving one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the entire state. The folder in her hands suddenly looked very small. Around the table, the participants remained calm, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Because the meeting she had just interrupted wasn't about neighborhood rules at all. It was about state-level environmental policy affecting shoreline communities. And ironically, one of the topics already being discussed involved complaints from homeowners across several HOAs about aggressive enforcement practices. Complaints about excessive fines, harassment, board members overstepping their authority. In that moment, the situation flipped completely. The person who had spent weeks trying to control the cabin had just walked directly into a legal discussion about abuse of HOA power. Over the next several days, the entire neighborhood started hearing about what happened. At first, the story sounded unbelievable. But as more details surfaced, residents began realizing something important. The situation wasn't just about one cabin anymore. Many people had quietly experienced similar pressure. Small fines, strange warnings, the uncomfortable feeling that someone from the HOA was constantly watching. Within a week, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting. Attendance was higher than anyone had ever seen. Neighbors filled the room asking questions. How were enforcement decisions made? Who decided when fines were issued? Did board members actually have the authority to confront residents the way it had happened to the cabin? The answers weren't clear. And that uncertainty changed everything. Within months, the HOA introduced new policies. Fines required multiple board approvals. Board members were discouraged from confronting residents directly. And most importantly, the association clarified the limits of its authority. Private homes were still private homes. HOA rules could guide shared spaces, but they could not control every aspect of a homeowner's life. The fine against the cabin was dismissed. Others were quietly dropped as well. And the board member who had pushed hardest for aggressive enforcement stepped away from her position soon after. Eventually, someone else took the role. Someone focused more on community than control. Today, the cabin looks exactly as it always did. Sunlight glitters across the lake behind it. Friends occasionally park in the driveway. Neighbors stop by to talk on the porch. And no one feels the need to count how many cars are there anymore. Because the entire conflict changed something deeper in the community. People remembered why they moved there in the first place. Not to watch each other. Not to enforce rulebooks like law enforcement. But to live quietly beside the water. And sometimes, all it takes to remind a community of that balance is one person opening the wrong door at the wrong moment and discovering the authority they believed they had was never really theirs to begin with.